guys, welcome to my talk today, which will be on how the 1920s revolutionised femininity. And I'll be looking at the evolution of the flapper, what she wore, how she dressed, the makeup that she wore, and how women had the freedom to express themselves. But first, a little introduction. I write the content for Findmypast's sister site, the British Newspaper Archive, and I do this special feature for our social media, which is on this day 100 years ago. So I'm looking at all the headlines from 1921. So I've been basically living in 1921 since January. So as you can probably tell, I'm very excited about the 1921 census of England and Wales being released in January. And I wanted to look at the women in the census who were on the cusp of this great social change. Soon they would be wearing shorter skirts and shorter hair. And even I've been inspired to cut my hair shorter and dress up for you today and attempt a little bit of 1920s makeup. So over the next hour, half an hour or so, expect to hear more about bobs, lipstick, movies, and the changing role of women in society. So let's get started. So I guess we've all heard the word flapper. She's a good time girl, isn't she? She drinks, she dances, she's the symbol of women in the 1920s. But how did she come about? But before we get there, I just wanted to draw your attention to this wonderful picture, which shows chorus girls in New York having their stockings painted on in 1924. All the photos and all the text and quotes for this presentation comes from a wonderful newspaper collection, which is available on Findmypast and also available on the British Newspaper Archive. But the flapper didn't always have the same meaning as we give it today. No, indeed. So what we did, we searched for early mentions of the flapper in our newspaper collections. It's available on both Findmypast and the British Newspaper Archive. And indeed, rather alarmingly for the purposes of this talk, we found this article on flapper shooting. And this is from the 25th of August, 1888. And in this instance, the flapper is a type of bird who is being hunted. So how did the word flapper come to describe a generation of women in the 1920s? So by the early 1900s, the word flapper was being used in a completely different sense. In the north of England at this time, the word flapper could be applied to a teenage girl who wore her hair in a ponytail, so it quite literally flapped on her back. Also, the word flap since the 1630s has meant prostitute in Britain. So a flapper could mean a young prostitute. However, by the early 20th century, increasingly the word was being applied to teenage girls without that particular inference. And very specifically, it was being used to describe teenage girls who were not yet wearing their hair up and who were not yet wearing those long frocks. And we found this wonderful image from Modern Life, which was formerly called Modern Man, which is it's a journal that is well worth a browse. It really illuminates Edwardian and post-First World War culture. And this particular illustration shows flappers in Rotten Row. And you can see that their hair is in ponytails, flapping on their back probably as they're on horseback. And the date, 1913, means that it's still being used in that sense, the sense that it's set to change completely. So how did that word flapper begin to change its meaning? By the time the census of England and Wales was taken in 1921, the word flapper was beginning to be applied to older girls in their late teens and their early 20s. And indeed, it had quite a derogatory meaning. It began to be applied to impetuous, immature women, irrespective of their age. Indeed, it actually began to signal an independent woman, which must have been very alarming for the men of the day. So, cementing this notion of the flapper in popular culture was the release of the film Flapper, The Flapper, starring Olive Thomas, in May 1920. And this was the first film that really showed the flapper lifestyle. Although that famous image of the flapper with her bobbed hair, the shorter dresses, had really yet to be cemented. And so we searched our newspaper collections, available on Findmypast and the British Newspaper Archive, to see how the word was being used in 1920. And we found plenty of fascinating results. And as you can see here, you can filter your results by year. So we were able to bring up the year 1920 and look to see what the newspapers were saying about the word flapper. And it turns out that they had plenty to say. So we found this wonderful article from the Nottingham Journal in May 1920, a real flapper on flappers, a piquant talk with Edna Best. And Edna Best professed to be a flapper. And she said, you know, people are making a big mistake when they say that the made-up, fast-looking things that have swarmed about London during the war are representative of the English flapper. They are nothing of the kind, and all the real flappers are wild with rage at being forced into the same category. The flapper is now a term of contempt. The idiotic behaviour of a number of girls who have mostly long past the flapper age has long been the cause of this, and the large innocents have had to suffer in the consequence. So Edna Best here is expressing her frustration with the conflation of the old and the new being these fast girls about town who like to go out and have a good time, and how that is now interacting with her understood and received notion of what the flapper is, just a young innocent woman. But what did it mean to Edna Best to be a flapper? And she said, it is a very jolly thing to be a real flapper, but the public don't know the genuine type, for she has neither the time nor the inclination to gad about with foolish young men. She is as healthy as in mind as she is in body. And although she loves dances and theatres, she can be quite happy without them until she puts her hair up and ceases to be a flapper. So again, you get this notion of the flapper as someone with her hair is down. So Edna Best believes that the new version of the flapper, the type who likes to strut around like some weird bird of paradise, will become practically extinct. She believes that this new notion of the flapper won't endure. But of course, this idea of the flapper, which Edna Best hated, that would become enduring. And it's so fascinating to look back on these newspapers from 1920, on the cusp of such a huge social change, and see the predictions that people had about society. And that's why exploring our newspaper collection can be so valuable to understand people's opinions from the day. Meanwhile, we found another article called The Flapper from the Leeds Mercury, which is from November 1920, and it gives another explanation of the word flapper. It says, she is a modern product and enjoys a freedom that would have left her grandmother aghast. And that's it. Freedom is the heart of this growing flapper culture, the most important element in how notions of femininity would change and develop in the 1920s. And the Leeds Mercury continues. She insists on going her own way and satisfying her own desires, and with all, it must be admitted that she knows how to take care of herself. She sounds rather wonderful, and I, for one, would like to get to know her. So we can already see how this idea of what a flapper is and how she behaves, with more freedom, drinking, dancing, going to the theatres, going about with young men, was developing already in 1920, and it would only develop more as the 1920s progressed. And here are some images which is taken from a series that was printed in the Bystander magazine. And it was a satirical column called The American Flapper in London. And it appeared in 1922. And this is what you could expect from a typical column. Our American flapper has an unsuccessful romance with a British major. She is distressed because he doesn't know how to foxtrot. And she says, oh, imagine I can never be happily married to a man who doesn't foxtrot. Foxtrot being the particularly popular dance of the day. Charleston and yet to sort of gain popularity. But that doesn't stop our American flapper from making hay. She says, and I'll go for the American accent. We, meaning the major, myself, and some of his ducky friends, have touched all the high spots with all 6 cylinders hitting high. We have danced in every hotel and nightclub in town, and there are scats of them, loveliest places you ever kicked a toe in. I'd better just explain that nightclubs are just dancing places. I don't know why they call them that, except it has something to do with some LCC, whoever he is. From my pink shell is, Mr. LCC is the official gloom of London town. LCC being at the London County Council. And she goes on to relate the joys of the trip to the theatre, which is a chance to drink and grow merry. And if you are thirsty, you can dash out to the promenade at the end of the first act and get a shot of honest-to-God liquor. Not hooch, my dear, liquor. So you can see that little nod to Prohibition. So the American flappers having a great time in London town. And this depiction of the lovable but ditzy American flapper really confirms this stereotype of a fun-loving figure who enjoys nothing better than drinking and dancing, perhaps to the detriment of everything else. But just a few short years after the horrors of the First World War, it is easy to understand how a nation's youth might want to turn to fun and frivolity in order to escape the tragedy of what went before. So we now have an idea of what it was like to be a flapper, that lifestyle, the increased freedom she enjoyed, the nightclubs and the theatres that she frequented. But how did she acquire that iconic image that we're trying to replicate here? Maybe not successfully. But the flapper image had a lot to do with the famous women of the time, the stars of the silent movies, the way they did their hair, what they wore, and how they did their makeup. And actresses Colleen Moore and Louise Brooks are pictured here. Colleen Moore is on the left with her bob and statement lipstick, and she is dubbed by the Tatler in 1924 as the perfect flapper. Whilst it was Louise Brooks here on the right who was said to have the most famous bob of the day, which inspired women across Britain and the world to cut their hair. Film stars were cutting their hair, like Mary Pickford, probably one of the most famous film stars of the day, and she's pictured there in the bottom left-hand corner. And we have Marion Mitchell, who was a society heiress at the top right, and she was described as embracing that fashionable, piquant style for a modern maid. And these styles, they were filtering down to the ordinary woman on the street who watched the film stars in the cinemas, read the magazines with the fashions of the day. And short hair was becoming more than fashion. It was becoming a movement. And as hairdresser Monsieur Eugène proclaimed in 1929, short hair is not a whim of fashion. It is significant for an adaptation to modern existence. It was and is revolutionary. And so by the end of the decade, Anthony, the oracle of many of the best coiffed Parisians, announced, "We must admit that long hair has lived, but it is now definitely dead." So the act of cutting one's hair was an act of rebellion. And this quote is from Britannia and Eve. When women first turned her attention to bobbing and shingling her hair, perhaps she dispensed with a greater part of the care which her mother and grandmother took to keep their hair well brushed and combed. It was not just their hair that women were dispensing with. They were dispensing with tradition. The act in itself represented an emancipation from the cultural and ideological trappings of traditional femininity. It was revolution. But how could ordinary women go about getting their hair cut in the prescribed styles of the day? Well, we found an array of adverts for hairdressers in our collection, with local salons offering a range of services: bobbing, shingling, shampooing, setting, Marcel waving. And it wasn't enough just to have the bobbed hair, it had to be waved too. So at Harrods hairdressing salon, which you can see an advert for there, in June 1928, you could get your bobbed hair set with a permanent wave for 6 guineas. Now, how much is this? It's £250 today. But for this, your waved hair could withstand hot weather, swimming, and constant brushing and washing. But there were cheaper options available, however. There was Lavona Wonder Liquid, which was advertised in the Tatler in 1925. For, according to the copy, wavy bobbed hair makes a girl look younger and prettier, while straight, wispy bobbed hair gives her an older, somewhat harsher appearance. Luckily, Lavona could work its magic to make bob hair both lustrous and wavy. There was an alternative to Lavona too. There were Heinz hair wavers for shingled or bobbed hair. For nature alone won't wave the hair. Heinz wavers too must do their share. Well, I don't know about you, but I am certainly sold. And I imagine this is a much cheaper option than the waving that was done at the Harrods hairdressing salon. But what if you couldn't commit to the latest fashions? Well, and according to the Tatler, there were some who did regret their choice. There are many women today who basically regret the fact that their hair is bobbed, as it has lost its charm in their eyes. And this statement was from 1923, so quite early on. And luckily, help was on hand for these women. So as you can see in this advertisement for a Plantignon, I think that's how you say it, which was available from Mermelodes at 104 Wigmore Street in West London. For those mourning the loss of their locks, they could buy one of these things for £4 and 3 shillings, about £170 today, so not cheap. The Plantignon was cleverly shaped to the back of the neck and made it look as though the wearer was possessed of a long braid instead of just a short bob. So you could go from traditional to flapper from just unhitching your Plantignon. What a thought. So we know now how the bob became so popular and how you could get one, how you could maintain those perfect waves. But makeup was another important part of how notions of femininity changed in the 1920s. Before, makeup was associated with prostitutes and actresses, not with respectable young women. But the 1920s changed this, especially with the appetite for colourful, bright lipsticks. Although, as we shall see, there were those who were opposed to the lipstick revolution. So the modern young woman, unlike her predecessors a generation before, actually wore makeup in public. You know, it might be something that you sort of put a little rouge on, but you would never want to be, you wouldn't want to be noticed wearing makeup. And so the Coventry Evening Telegraph provides a glimpse of church parade fashions, which were on show at Hyde Park in May 1928. And these very young women had smoothly powdered faces or sunburn colouring with lips carmine to match a bright red buttonhole. Women could now change the way they looked, and they could express themselves through the makeup that they wore. And there were lots of options for them, especially in the lipsticks they could choose. But according to one beauty specialist writing for the Yorkshire Evening Post in 1928, cerise is the correct colour for lipstick, and that practically no other colour is sold in Paris, though every other shade is offered from apricot down to a deep crimson that is almost purple. No wonder how another beauty correspondent wrote for the Sunderland Daily Echo a decade later in 1938 that times had brightened, and they most certainly had. And so, in the 1920s, lipstick had become that hallmark of modernity. It is so embodied in the times that artists began to use it as a medium for their work, including Dutch artist Keys Van Dongen. And he was famous as being the painter of ultra-modern women with their slender elegance, their look of quality, and their unashamed makeup. And unashamed is key here. Before, the wearing of makeup was associated with shame, but no more. And he produced this wonderful drawing you can see here called The Lipstick, which was actually painted in lipstick. And the Bystander in 1929 provided this wonderful vignette of Van Dongen at work. One afternoon, Van Dongen gave a tea at his studio, and one of his guests asked him to make a sketch of her. He borrowed her rouge and off he started. So as to not make the tonality of the portrait monotonous, he ran around the studio borrowing other ladies' lipsticks. I need a little Guerlain here, he said, and I could use a little Chanel there. And as we delved through the pages of our newspaper collections available on Findmypast and the British Newspaper Archive, we saw that how throughout the 1920s, more and more lipstick adverts were populating our newspaper pages. And this is one from the Daily Mirror in 1928. The product advertised here is Kissproof lipstick. In it, one lady on horseback advises her friend, also on horseback, to try Kissproof, my dear. You won't need lipstick again today. Kissproof is described as the modern, waterproof lipstick, which is changing the cosmetic habits of women everywhere. Promising not to stain handkerchiefs, teacups, and cigarettes like other ordinary lipsticks, it claimed to be as permanent as day is long. But what we love most about this ad And what is so very telling about it is how this lipstick is called Kissproof, arguably suggesting how the woman wearing it will be free to kiss as many times and perhaps as many men as she likes. The lipstick, therefore, becomes a symbol of newfound sexual freedom and liberation that women were beginning to enjoy in the 1920s. But lipstick and its users, and users of makeup in general, in the 1920s did have their detractors. Lipstick was called Vanity Baton in this top illustration, which was drawn by William Ablett in 1923. And actress Jessie Matthews offered her own opinion on the subject, albeit while she was opening a new beauty palace at Bayswater. She said, "London girls are too fond of applying their lipstick," going on to say, "There is little or no reason for young girls to make up as they are doing. There is plenty of time to decorate after one has reached the age of 30. So having myself just turned 30 in September, I guess I have all the permission I need to decorate my face." Meanwhile, journalist Leonora Isles for the Daily Herald in August 1929 had some more choice words for those women who wore lipstick. And it is evident that Isles hated lipstick, proclaiming how it made women's mouths ugly and how it must be very disconcerting for a young man to kiss a girl whose mouth looks like a large red cut across her face. Recently, I noticed a lipstick girl at tea. Every bite of her bread and butter or cake left a red imprint, and her cigarette end was also red, which had a peculiarly disgusting effect. And one beauty specialist for the Yorkshire Evening Post in March 1928 noted how many crimes are committed with the lipstick. But not to fear, help was on hand. You could get lessons on how to apply your makeup, your powder, your rouge, and your lipstick, like these ones that were given at the fashion salon of D.M. Brown in Dundee. There, you could learn the technique of makeup for any occasion, daytime or evening, with private consultations also offered. So very much like we have at the department stores of today. But still, women were facing backlash for wearing makeup. And perhaps this was the thing that so deviated from the traditional notions of femininity that really riled men and women even who could not accept that things were changing. And nowhere was this more apparent than in a breach of promise case for a broken engagement, which was heard in 1928. The man who brought the case about had objected to his fiance's lipstick and face colouring. And it was ruled by Justice Rigby Smith that a man engaged to a girl has the right to tell her that she must not wear powder or lipstick. And I'm going to repeat this. A man engaged to a girl has the right to tell her that she must not wear powder or lipstick. Can you imagine? And the women of the day, quite rightly, in 1928, they were outraged too. And the Gloucestershire Citizen featured their incredulous responses. So one of the 10 London girls who were interviewed by the Press Association said, no girl objects to a man shaving to improve his appearance. So why should they object to our lipstick and powder? Let my Jim try it. Meanwhile, one typist said, she had never heard of such a thing. My young man has no more right to tell me not to use powder and lipstick than I have not to tell him he mustn't use brilliantine or scented soap. But the final word on this matter goes to quite a wonderful character in the shape of Fanny Ward. Fanny was described as a 61-year-old flapper by the Gloucestershire Citizen. And by 1928, hadn't the implications of this word changed? No longer was she the flapper, a young teenager with a ponytail. A flapper now could be any woman who conformed to the bright fashions of the day, who liked to dance and have fun. And Fanny, 61-year-old Fanny, was one of them. And she had no time for Justice Rigby Smith's ruling, saying, I think a girl has every right to use powder and lipstick. What she does to enhance her beauty is no business of her young man. We know young men don't like powder and lipstick, judging by the fuss they make. But what does that matter? And what did it matter, indeed, what men thought? The flapper didn't care. She had escaped his control. She could do her face as she liked, have her hair short, and even wear trousers. And now back to our popular image of the flapper, who had changed from her debut in the 1920 film of the same name. Actress Clara Beau was perhaps the most famous flapper of her day. And the films she starred in often featured her in that flapper role. And on the left, she stars in The Wild Party, which was from 1929, as the leader of the harebrained maidens who were studying at a women's college whose hell-raising antics would often lead them in trouble. And here they sit, despondent on the steps outside of a party, having been kicked out for wearing too scanty clothing. Meanwhile, on the right, Clara Beau is pictured in her role in Dancing Mothers. It's from 1927, in which she portrays a very modern miss. In these 5 stills, she is shown in the 5 stages of drunkenness, her bob messy by the end, but her makeup still perfect. But was this the reality for the average woman in Britain? This popular image made famous by Clara Beau in the movies of the day. It is important never to generalise in these cases, but for the majority of Britain's female population, the lifestyle depicted by Beau was quite simply out of their reach, perhaps to be enjoyed by the upper classes who had both the leisure and the money to enjoy it. However, for the normal woman on the street, the flapper had given her a new style, a new freedom in what she wore and how she enjoyed herself. For example, she would have enjoyed going to a local dance or hop, such as this one, which is described in the Birmingham Daily Gazette most evocatively. Dancing is in full swing, and the floor is comfortably crowded. Most of the refreshment tables are either occupied by couples or parties. You will note that the drinks are of the most innocuous character, nothing more than lemonade, coffee, etc. A jazz band is playing with what some of the dancers were described as a snappy foxtrot, and the rhythmic infection of it is visible everywhere. The flappers here are not big drinkers. They are enjoying the music and simply being young. The newspaper observing, the eagerness of youth radiates a physical vitality which spreads itself in the joyousness of the dance. And that, in essence, was what it meant to be a flapper in the 1920s, enjoying the moment, enjoying the novelty of the new things available to them, the fashions, the music, the greater freedoms. They were busy seizing the day that had been denied to the youth of the decade before. Being a flapper did not necessarily mean scraping the barrels of hedonistic extremes. For the majority of women, that was just not possible. But it was possible now to enjoy being a woman in a different way, with more independence than they had ever had before. So, what's next? Whilst we impatiently wait for the release of the 1921 census of England and Wales, have a think. How old were your female ancestors in the 1921 census? Do you think they would have cut their hair, gone out to dances? Do you have any photographs? I was lucky enough to have a photo of my great-grandmother. She would have been about 20 when the census was taken, and the photo that I have shows her with a bob, so she went along with those fashions. And meanwhile, have a browse of our newspapers. That way you can really find out what it was like to actually live in the 1920s. You have your glossy papers, like many of the ones I've used here, like the Sphere and the Tatler and the Sketch. They really give you a sense of the fashions and the glamour. But local papers give you a sense of everyday life, like the bops and the dances that were held, and also some really interesting opinion pieces with people writing in correspondence about what they thought about makeup, what they thought about the dances of the day, what they thought about flappers. And we also have some really special 1920s titles that we've recently added to the collections on both Findmypast and the British Newspaper Archive. These are really beautiful, beautiful things to browse, and they give you an idea of the aspirations of someone in the 1920s, the impossible glamour of the movies, the dawn of an exciting motoring age. So what would your ancestors in the 1920s be thinking about, be dreaming about? What changes in their lives were they about to face? And meanwhile, would you have enjoyed yourself living in the 1920s? Well, I know I for sure might have done. Thank you so much. I really hope you enjoyed learning more about flapper culture, and I hope to see you soon.